Speaking Retell Lecture, guided practice session. Let's begin. Here's your first question.
Okay, so I want to start by talking about African Americans. Now, certainly the period of conflict, of actual fighting during the Revolution really stirred things up in the realm of slavery in a number of ways. For one thing, on the sort of simple basic level of logistics, the war just created confusion and disorder. And because things were disordered in wartime, it provided some opportunities for slaves to escape. So just the mass confusion of war enabled some slaves to flee plantations and perhaps to pose as free men. Equally important, the Revolution spread its message to Black Americans as well as to white Americans. The message of the Revolution, or maybe the messages, plural, of the Revolution were not invisible to Black Americans, free Black Americans or enslaved Black Americans. Regardless of whether they were free or enslaved, people could hear these messages, this rhetoric of liberty and freedom, and translate it into their own lives.
Here's the sample response. The lecturer talks about the war and its influence on African Americans. Due to the disorder associated with the war, several slaves were able to escape and gain freedom. The revolution also spread a message among the African Americans. When they heard about freedom, they also wanted to bring it in their own lives. War was a very important time for Black Americans. Now, when you look at the image, you can see it is something about freedom, some kind of a struggle. And you look at the person behind the freedom sign. So you can guess this could be something about related to African Americans, or it could be some event in South Africa, some kind of a freedom struggle, some kind of a movement for rights. So, and with that in mind, then you start listening. And right in the first couple of sentences, the lecturer, mentions African Americans. So that further points you in the right direction, and then talks about the war and that they were able to escape the plantations and the confusion of war. So all of this has to go, all of these points, but in a brief manner, have to go in your notes. You don't really need to write the full word African American, because I'm sure the picture will help you remember it. But you can mention war. You can have an arrow which says freedom and revolution. So basically, this is about how the war, it played an important role in the freedom struggle, or in the struggle for rights, equal rights for Black Americans. And when you visualize in your mind, you will see Black Americans, you might see Martin Luther King, and you might see, then when she mentions the war, so you'll see a war, soldiers on the border. She mentions plantations, so you'll see the slaves running away from the plantations. It's almost like the scenes from a movie. So if I show you a movie, you know how easy it is to tell what the movie is about. Most people, they can even recall most of the scenes, major scenes from the movie, and repeat them in great detail. And the same, then you can. That's why visualization is so important. The notes, they are important because so that you don't miss any key concept. Visualization and the pictures that you associate with those notes, they make it so much easier to respond, because you can just look at them and they're almost like complete sentences in themselves. Let's see the next question.
I went into theater, wanted to be an actor, director, generally had no idea what I wanted to do, actually. So I went to UT Austin. I got my degree in theater arts and studied history. And then from there, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I moved in and got my master's in world history. I thought I'd become a teacher, and until my professor told me, my last year of my master's, you don't really want to become a professor these days. So I said, well, what am I going to do now? I guess I'll on the suggestion of a girlfriend at the time, I'll just go to law school. So, well, I guess I'll do that. So I went to law school, and but all throughout this time, I kept writing screenplays, stories, poems, all these things. I've always been a highly creative person, and I've always wanted to expand in that area. And I went to law school, went to Baylor Law School, graduated with my JD in 2008. And sort of what the impetus for me becoming a children's book author was my mother was.
Here's the sample response. The lecturer talks about his career progression. He initially wanted to become an actor or a director, and with that thought, got a degree in theater arts and history. After his master's in history, he thought he'll become a professor, but was discouraged to do so by his own professor. On the suggestion of his girlfriend, he started studying law and got a JD. The push to become a children's author was likely from his mother. So the lecture is a good overview of the speaker's career journey. When you see the image, the title is Children's Author James R. Thomas. So it tells you that this is going to be about this person. And then when the person starts talking about, he says, I wanted to be this, then I wanted to be this, I started with this. In lectures like this, where they talk about a journey or a progression, the best way to take the notes is you write the words and then connect them with arrows so that it's first you can just write arts and HIST, so arts and history, then an arrow prof, so you wanted to be a professor, then an arrow studied law, then an arrow children's author. And on the arrow, maybe you can also write down mother. So it shows that his mother gave the idea to the push to become a children's author. And then in the conclusion, you can say, there are different ways again you could have concluded. You can say that the lecture shows that the speaker was never certain of his career direction. Or, as we have said, is a good overview of the speaker's career journey. Or, the lecturer talks about all the steps in his career journey. So keep it simple. Whatever comes to your mind is fine. And as we discussed, the best way that you could have captured these notes is sort of almost like if you are drawing a workflow or a flow chart, right? But in a simple way, just a word or half a word and then arrow the next step and then an arrow the next step. Then when you look at it, it becomes very easy to tell. He first did a degree in theater and arts, then wanted to be a professor, then wanted to study law and all of that. Okay. Let's look at the next question now.
When reading about Michael Faraday's early life, it's hard to believe that he would eventually become one of the most significant scientific minds in history. He was one of the fathers of modern electricity and went on to influence and inspire other brilliant minds, including Albert Einstein. Famed physicist Ernest Rutherford said it best when he stated that, quote, when we consider the magnitude and extent of his discoveries and their influence on the progress of science and of industry, there is no honour too great to pay to the memory of Faraday, one of the greatest scientific discoverers of all time. End quote. We have Faraday to thank for the modern electric motor, generator and transformer. Michael Faraday was born on the 22nd of September in 1791 in the village of Newington Butts near London. In this time period it was normal for parents to give the most complete and expensive education to the firstborn child, assuming of course that child was male. As Faraday's parents weren't well off, and Faraday was the third of 4 children, he received a very limited and brief early education. This did not deter the future scientist, however, and he took his education into his own hands. He found a great way to do this when he became the apprentice to a local bookseller and bookbinder at the age of 14.
The sample response. The lecture describes Michael Faraday's early life and his astonishing rise in the world of science. He is credited for the birth of modern electricity and for providing inspiration to others, such as Einstein. His other inventions included electric motor and generator. It is surprising that such a talented person was born in a poor family and had little early education. He was largely self-taught with the help of books he got access to through his job as an apprentice to a local bookseller. This highlights his discipline and love for science. Now, simply by looking at the picture, you'll come to know that the lecture is going to be about Michael Faraday, and it mentions his years, 1791 to 1867. So probably the lecture is going to be about his life journey. And just as we saw in the previous lecture, this is like a pattern. This lecture will also follow a pattern, and the pattern is, it tells you again the journey. First this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So when you are taking notes, make sure that you capture those things. That he was from a poor family, no education, self-taught, then birth of modern electricity, inspired Einstein, etc. And then you can sum it up by saying that the way we have done this highlights his discipline and love for science, or you can say it can be concluded that Michael Faraday faced a lot of struggles, but still rose to prominence in the world of science. Or you can keep it very simple and just say something like this. It can be concluded that the lecture is a good overview of Michael Faraday's life history. So whatever comes to your mind, a simple conclusion is good enough. And the way you have taken notes, I hope you were able to capture all the major events that were mentioned in the lecture. And that's a pattern. All the lectures like this, which are about a person, which are about those events, they will have some key moments. And you should try to follow those key moments and then talk about them in your lecture. And when you visualize this, you can almost visualize this on a timeline. That he was born, you first see a picture, a little boy, poor, little education. Then, a slightly older child working at a bookseller and reading science books. And then further inventing electricity, providing inspiration to Einstein, etc. And making other inventions, electric motor and generator. So it's almost, you can imagine it's going on a time scale. Let's go to the final question in this session. Here it is.
We have to start by admiring my jewellery. Does anybody know what it might be?
Is it part of an asteroid?
It's part of an asteroid, part of a meteorite. One that fell in Canada, in Alberta, about 1100 years ago, known as the White Court incident. And it was one that's largely made of iron, so you can find it with a metal detector. Interestingly, if one of these things lands in Canada, although it comes from outer space, the Canadians claim it as Canadian. And in order to bring this back to England, I needed an export license. So, what we're actually going to talk about this evening is impact by a big asteroid. There's tons of stuff lands on the Earth each day, about 100 tons. Most of it's fine dust and tiny, tiny particles. But what we're going to be mainly concerned with this evening is bigger stuff. And the bigger stuff is very probably originally an asteroid. There are millions of asteroids. They're the bits that are left over from the formation of the planets, probably because Jupiter's gravity prevented a planet forming. Suzanne's talked to you about how planets.
Here's a sample response. The lecturer talks about meteorites and asteroids in the lecture. She starts with talking about a jewelry which is made from a meteorite piece and then moves the discussion to a major asteroid. In comparison, most of the things that fall on Earth are dust and small particles, though it is almost 100 tons each day. Bigger entities of concern are asteroids, which are pieces remaining from planet formation process, possibly stopped by Jupiter's gravity. So when you see the picture, this is something discussion going to be about planets, about science, and it looks like an asteroid or some piece approaching a planet, that it's something around that. And when the lecturer starts talking, she first refers to her jewelry, but that is only as a way to introduce the topic. Because jewelry is made from a piece of a meteoroid, but then she says that the actual topic is she wants to talk about major asteroids. So when you take notes, that's how you will first start. You can write, if you mention the jewelry, just write down JEWELL and then a hyphen, and you can say it's made from a meteoroid, and then asteroid, and underline it to show that the major focus of the lecture is asteroids. That's what she's going to talk about. And in your mind, when you imagine, you will see that small dust, etc., they're coming from space, falling on one side. And on the other hand, you can imagine bigger pieces coming. And that bigger piece, that bigger asteroid is the major area of concern. Okay. So that's how you will be able to understand and remember all the key points, which in this case here. Now, so some of you might have made this mistake, written too much about her jewelry. You have to understand that the jewelry is just an example, a way of introducing the topic. The focus is meteoroids, asteroids, things falling on Earth. So that's something you have to practice, and you will learn with practice so as not to get sidetracked. Okay. I've seen when I gave this question to some students, their lecture was almost entirely about jewelry. That the lecturer is wearing very beautiful jewelry, and the people, her students, were very happy to hear her talk about the jewelry. You don't have to get sidetracked. Keep your focus on what the lecture is about. Again, like describe image, in Retell Lecture also, the content is important. So if you just go away from the topic or do not mention the key information which was there in the topic, you will not get full marks. So first get the content right, and then when you respond, then focus on fluency and pronunciation. So that's the end of this session. Please remember to practice in the test software.